anatomists and physiologists. This is another video in our endocrine system series. This is part 2. This is all about the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and the pineal gland. To start off, we have to understand where all of this stuff is. So this picture here that I'll zoom in on is the sagittal section of the brain. And if we look at this kind of like bottom portion, it kind of looks like duck lips. I think it personally looks like a little seahorse. There's his little belly. Anyways, I think it's really cute. But this guy here is called the hypothalamus, below the thalamus, and then off of the hypothalamus is the pituitary gland. So off of the pituitary gland, we can see that there is an anterior lobe called the anterior pituitary, and then the posterior lobe called the posterior pituitary. The anterior one that we're looking at here consists mostly of glandular tissue, so it makes and secretes lots and lots of hormones. And the posterior one is more neural in its structure, but it stores hormones rather than making them. We can call the hypothalamus and all of this stuff that's going on here, we can call all of this stuff neuroendocrine because they have both neural functions and endocrine functions. And when we get into the lab, your lab book likens the hypothalamus to like the CEO of the endocrine system. It's really like in charge. And when we learned about the hypothalamus in Bio 430, we learned about the hypothalamus as like that major homeostatic regulatory part of the brain. So that totally checks out. Okay, so back to this picture. This picture is showing you how the hypothalamus communicates with the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus up here sends its messages to the anterior pituitary. The hypothalamus secretes hormones that act on the anterior pituitary gland in two ways. Let me zoom in here. So we act on the anterior pituitary in two ways. I'm going to get my highlighter. I'm going to highlight in pink. The hypothalamus can release hormones that are called releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So releasing hormones promote release of a hormone from the anterior pituitary, and inhibiting hormones then will inhibit that release. Then the anterior pituitary gland responds appropriately. So it either releases that hormone or it doesn't. And here is a big old list of the hormones that the anterior pituitary gland releases. So the first one is growth hormone. Growth hormone, that's this one here. The growth hormone promotes just that growth. It increases growth of the skeleton and of the cartilage. It promotes cell division, cell growth, and it also increases cell metabolism. So things like blood glucose, fat breakdown, release, etc., to make sure that all the growth that we're doing has the energy that we need. From Bio 430, we did discuss growth hormone from the anterior pituitary in the context of the epiphyseal plate. That's the cartilage growth plate in the bones that gradually grows during childhood and then it closes and fully becomes bone at the end of puberty. So speaking of growth hormone, this picture is showing you when different examples of growth hormone disorders. So if there's hypersecretion of growth hormone during childhood, this results in too much growth. That's this person here. So too much growth during childhood, that's called hypersecretion of growth hormone. And that would lead to a disorder called gigantism. Notice, though, that the proportions are all correct, as we would expect them to be. The flip side of this is that if secretion is too low during childhood, this would result in hyposecretion. And that leads to pituitary dwarfism. Both of these disorders result in normal body proportions because it happens during childhood, but just more or less growth depending on what it is. Pituitary dwarfism, though, if caught early, it can also be treated with hormone replacement therapy, and that is usually done with human growth hormone, which HGH, which is a synthetic growth hormone. There are some downsides and risks to this, and that's the same human growth hormone that's not allowed in most sports. Okay, back to the anterior pituitary. The rest of the hormones on this list here. So we already talked about growth hormone, but the rest of the hormones in this list are called tropic hormones. Tropic hormones are hormones that are released by the anterior pituitary gland to regulate the activity of other endocrine organs. So they act on other endocrine organs to release or not release their products. Okay, so the first is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. So that means that TSH will go act on the thyroid to release its hormones appropriately. The next is adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. Adreno refers to the adrenal gland. Cortico refers to specifically the adrenal cortex, and then tropic is the regulatory piece. So this hormone, ACTH, regulates the activity of the adrenal cortex, which is like the outer part of the adrenal gland. A lot of the time, ACTH stimulates the release of corticosteroid hormones. So this will release corticosteroid hormones. Cortico, again, referring to cortex of that adrenal gland. And ACTH is released because the hypothalamus tells it to be released. And that release from the hypothalamus, so that release of ACTH from the hypothalamus is called corticotropin releasing hormone. Corticotropin releasing hormone. Remember that the hypothalamus can release either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. So the fact that this is a releasing hormone means that ACTH is encouraged to be released by the actions of CRH from the hypothalamus. Okay, next is are this group of tropic hormones, FSH and LH. These guys are called gonadotropins, meaning that they act on regulating the activities of the gonads. So the FSH has a role in gamete production, so like sperms and eggs, and then LH helps with those gonadal hormones and does a bunch of other stuff. So when it works with FSH, LH and FSH work to promote the maturation of ovarian follicles, which are just like little bits of ovary that have the egg cell in it. But then LH also triggers ovulation, which is the release of the egg from the ovary. Gonadotropins aren't really produced in significant amounts pre-puberty, but once the hypothalamus says to be released at the appropriate time, puberty, then that's when they're released in more amounts. We'll talk about this more when we get to our reproductive unit. Okay, and then lastly is prolactin, or PRL. Prolactin stimulates milk production. And this is for in breastfeeding. And prolactin is usually prevented from being released by dopamine. So dopamine kind of shuts off the production of prolactin. But when dopamine falls, that leads to prolactin being released. And prolactin levels, it's very rhythmic. They rise and fall with blood estrogen levels. So blood estrogen levels and prolactin levels kind of like track each other. And they rise a lot, the levels of prolactin, near the end of pregnancy and after birth, as well as during breastfeeding. Okay, so that is the anterior pituitary. There's a lot going on there. The posterior pituitary is mostly neural tissue. So for the purposes of the endocrine system, we care that it can act as storage for hormones. And those two hormones are oxytocin. I'll highlight these. So we have oxytocin and ADH. Oxytocin and ADH. So oxytocin, well, right here on the left-hand side, oxytocin does a lot of things. It's released during childbirth and nursing. And it also causes uterine contractions. The hypothalamus is signaled to make oxytocin by that signal of the cervix is being stretched, nearing, like as birth gets closer. And oxytocin levels in the blood rise and rise and rise, be released, released, released from the posterior pituitary until birth. Oxytocin is also released and allows for milk ejection. So, uterine contractions and also milk ejection from the breast during breastfeeding. And this is a reflex-based thing. So the act of suckling causes oxytocin release, which then allows for the letdown or the release of milk. We'll talk more about this in the repro unit. So oxytocin is also a neurotransmitter. So neurotransmitter too. And that's because in the brain, oxytocin also acts, but it's involved in sexual, affectionate behavior, trust and bonding and nurturing and all of that kind of thing in that group. And the textbook calls this the cuddle hormone. So the other one that we just talked about that was oxytocin over here. And then ADH is the other one. ADH stands for anti-diuretic hormone. So anti-diuretic hormone, ADH. We've talked a little bit about ADH because it promotes water staying in the blood, which helps preserve blood volume, which then helps preserve blood pressure, right? And ADH acts on the kidneys because it promotes more water going back into the blood in the event that the blood has too many solutes. So usually like there's not enough water in it. And this helps preserve our blood volume, which is important that blood flow, pressure is all enough. This also makes less fluid pass through the kidneys, which means less urine is produced. So we'd say something that's a diuretic is something that promotes the activity of diuresis, urination. Anti-diuretic means that it's less urination happening. ADH, interestingly, is inhibited by alcohol. So when drinking alcohol, there's lots of urine production, and drinking alcohol is actually pretty dehydrating because of that. You're like losing a lot of your water. The following several slides are tables from your textbook that I think are just nice summaries of what each of these hormones do. So there's ADH and oxytocin, we just talked about from the posterior pituitary. And then there's also from the anterior pituitary, there's growth hormone. Notice like which one is highlighted here, right? Growth hormone, and then all of those other ones we just talked about. Last thing we have to discuss for this video is the pineal gland. It's a little pine cone shaped gland in the diencephalon of the brain, and it produces melatonin, which is an amino acid based hormone. Melatonin levels, they're rhythmic. The lowest melatonin levels are like around noon, and the highest are at night. And this happens due to like how much light there is. So melatonin is the thing that like helps regulate kind of day and night cycles, that kind of thing, but it also helps inform the hypothalamus because there's a lot of melatonin receptors there. And those melatonin receptors influence the timing of various physiological processes, like body temperature, like sleep, like eating. That's all I have for this video, and then the next video is like all of the other endocrine organs.